I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You were there once in your life.
Hey, people, this is Trish Wood here. And this is Trish Wood is Critical, the podcast about critical thinking. I have a confession to make for you all today. I am not doing well. I've had a very, very difficult professional experience recently, and it kind of blew up yesterday. And, I think these things are maybe post-COVID. Everybody's fragile. I haven't slept for a couple of nights. It's been extremely, extremely, extremely difficult for me to navigate. And I almost didn't record a show today, but I never let you guys down. And you know what? I'm not being a martyr. It's therapy for me. So it's just, you may not get the full Trish Wood is Critical treatment today. I hope you do. I'm just sitting here doing what I'm doing without reams and reams of preparation. But we have an extraordinary guest for you. That is what matters always at the end of the day, isn't it? I'm so lucky. Sometimes God or whomever puts someone in your path right at the moment that you need the most. And I needed to be reminded about some things about myself, which sounds narcissistic. Please do forgive me. And Walter Kern, who is my guest today, is the type of interviewer, it's the best kind, because he's super smart himself, but he also makes you feel smarter about yourself. It's such an interesting dynamic. And there are some people I have that rapport with. As you know, Jeffrey Tucker is like my main man, discussing Mahler, and making me feel smarter. But he'd never say, Trish, you're stupid for not liking Mahler. But, we're just lucky to have those people in our lives and on the podcast. I'm so grateful. And as I said, I had a shit day yesterday and a terrible morning this morning. And then I got to interview Walter Kern, and he brings something not just to me in the post kind of COVIDian world we're living in now, but for all of us. And the thing that he is bringing is a new publication, a new kind of journalism. Well, it's old journalism, actually. So that is new and kind of radical, isn't it? It's called County Highway. I don't know if you've heard about it. People are really talking about this old school broadsheet that is published 6 times a year in America. And I'll just read you the gist of it. County Highway is a 20-page broadsheet produced by actual human beings, containing the best new writing you will encounter about America. It features reports on the political and spiritual crises that are gripping our country and their deeper cultural and historical sources. Regular columns about agriculture, civil liberties. See, agriculture and civil liberties can live together side by side in a sentence. That's what's so great about County Highway. Animals, yeah. Herbal medicine and living off the grid mentally and physically. We all need to be doing that more and more. Essays about literature and art, and an entire section devoted to music. Hello, Robbie Robertson. I bet he would have liked to read County Highway, and they might have even put him on the cover at one point. So sad to say he died recently. Our newspaper comes out 6 times a year and will be delivered to your home in a transparent envelope. Once the paper is removed, you can hold it in your hands, fold it into quarters, and read it on your porch on a sunny afternoon, accompanied by your favorite cup of coffee, cigarette, or can of beer. And for our English friends, I'll say maybe a G&T as well, our British friends. What you can't do is find our stories on the internet. You can only get them by subscription or by purchasing individual copies from our network of bookstores and record shops at the price of $8.50 per issue. And I will bet you that is an absolute steal, because what Walter and I talked about is how this paper, this broadsheet that they are publishing now and printing on a printing press, I assume, is kind of what the New Yorker was about the world from New York when that actually meant something, which is to say 80s and 90s. Those were the kind of, those were the late heydays. Of course, the John Cheever, Salinger days were the hey days. I think that was maybe the 40s and 50s. But anyway, back when the New Yorker was a go-to read for those of us on the left and the right, it was just really, really smart and detailed. But it isn't that anymore. And now we have County Highway, which is taking into account all the places in America that are not the bi-coastal, citified, crazy places. So isn't that interesting and fun? Let's embrace this. Let's embrace it. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to buy some and I will give them out. I'll buy maybe 5 and I will send them out to you guys. How can you get them? Okay. Go on to my Substack when I publish this story to accompany the podcast. And the first 5 people who respond in the comments will get a copy of County Highway. How do you like them apples? I just thought of that right now. I think it's a good thing to do. When you're feeling bad or sad about yourself, do something nice for other people. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm doing something nice, I hope, also for County Highway. And maybe you people will decide to sign up, and we should probably support these folks. They're good people. And I think, boy, oh boy, is the quality ever going to be there. There's some heavy, heavy hitters from a writing and reporting perspective on the masthead of this newspaper. So stand by for Walter Kern about County Highway. And then after that, you're going to get a little teaser section of Salome Siboney, who is a young writer and artist who is thinking super critically, which is a wonderful thing for a young person because so many of them are not these days, although I hate to generalize. That's not fair. But she's a really refreshing character for us to interview. So we've put her up today so you can hear her. And then she's going into our premium slot for our Substack premium members. So they get that little bit of extra something as a thank you from us for supporting our work here. Thank you all very, very much. And thank you to everybody who drops in. We're grateful. So I'll talk about my pitch now. I guess it's the right time to do it. My main platform is Substack, and we drop the podcast on all the big podcast platforms, but I also do a written piece in which you can link to it, and then you can comment below in the community of people. And we're getting a great one here. There's some really, really smart people commenting on what we're doing. And that makes it all the more fun. It's fun to get into a debate. It's fun also when people agree with you and you feel supported. It's just really cool to have people listening to the show and then coming here to comment. So please do that. And even better, you can support us there by buying a membership on Substack to the Trish Wood is Critical Substack effort. That would be wonderful. We also have on my website, which is trishwoodpodcast.com, some really cool merch, still lots of trucker merch, no hats as well. People love those. So if you buy some stuff from our merch store, and most of it is quite good quality too. I wouldn't sell something I was embarrassed about. That money goes to helping our show. So thank you very much for that. My Twitter is at Wood Reporting, and that's where we get kind of rowdy over there. A little bit. I get up in the morning and I go to Twitter, and I always feel like a bad person when I'm done because I'm so mad at what's happening in the world. Twitter does that, and I might take a bit of a break from it at some point, but there's a lot of interesting commenting going on. I am shadow banned too, by the way. Lots of people are still saying they don't see my tweets. So Elon, if you want to be a hero of free speech, you got to fix your algorithms there. Probably because of my gender critical reporting, which I take very seriously. And I owe you all a Substack, which is coming in the next day or so, that I have been researching based on a video documentary I saw about autogynephilia. It's important everybody knows what this is and how it is infecting the trans argument. It's taken over. These guys who get aroused by wearing women's clothing are the ones primarily who are the angry activists at these events. So they need to be weeded out, because that's not body dysphoria at all. That is something completely else. And there's all kinds of video of what goes on, as nauseating as I personally find that stuff. I know it's none of my business. And you know what? If you don't push the ideology on people, and nobody will be up in your business. So, right? You're doing this to yourself. As my mother used to say, you should have thought of that before. If you're going to march like you're pure as the driven snow under a human rights banner, you better not be doing it over a fetish, especially when our children are involved. So that is that. I just want to read you a few things about this wonderful little newspaper, which is called County Highway. And this is something that Walter said about it. We're going to hear from him live in a minute, but not live, but an interview in a minute. There's a Solzhenitsyn quote that at some point we wondered if we were allowed to talk about the experiences of our own lives. And I think America is at that point. I live in a kind of throwback America. I live in a town of 8,000 in Montana. Because it's a tourist town and because it's become a sort of shelter from the storm city since COVID, everybody's leaving the cities, it has people moving in from all over. Even the newcomers kind of conform to the pre-existing culture, which is to meet at the post office, talk, stand on the corner, share the news, and understand life through gossip, storytelling, and anecdote. Doesn't that sound ideal? There's still a legitimate way to understand life here. It was sorely tested during the pandemic, in particular, when people were afraid to talk. The main news source in this town is the steps of the downtown post office, but people hurried up and down with eyes averted and masks over their faces. That media source was blotted out. People started to understand things going on here through social media and even national outlets rather than by talking to somebody who had just been there. The crushing of the anecdotal, the personal experience as a valid form of cognition was amazing to watch. And it wasn't completely successful here, but I imagine in other places that don't have as deep a tradition of street corner news, it was much worse. Isn't that true about our own neighborhoods and where we live, right? He does talk about this in the interview, but I want to read this for you. Part of the hidden message in County Highway is that we want you to sit with this newspaper and a cup of coffee. There's no algorithm in County Highway. It takes a bit of concentration to read. It rewards a solitary experience. Maybe you can sit by yourself for 20 minutes in the morning and not be bombarded by headlines and what's being pushed at you. Doesn't that sound delicious? Okay. Here is my interview with Walter Kern, who is talking about his new venture, a broadsheet printed on paper only, you can't get it online, called County Highway, America's only newspaper. Hi, Walter. How are you?
I'm doing very well.
That's good. I think you're doing well because you're in Montana and I'm not.
Well, it certainly helps. Let me tell you, I've been traveling a lot recently in Montana. I feel like I'm, rested and ready to take on the world. I feel like I'm being chased when I'm in New York City and other places like that.
I know, hunted, right? It feels, I understand that. I feel that here where I live in Toronto. Let me ask you this though, is this a new phenomenon for you? Have you always kind of vibed in a place like Montana, or is that a reaction to kind of living, because New York is sort of used to be the literary center of the world. Did you move to Montana to escape something, or were you drawn to it, or did you always kind of want that in your life?
I grew up in a very small town, 500 people in rural Minnesota, and I went to public school, but left to go to Princeton, went out east, moved to England, went to Oxford University for a few years, and then came back to New York to work in magazines. But the whole time I was there, I had a kind of restlessness. When the seasons would change, I'd want to get out of the city, and I was still running on a kind of rural cycle in the subconscious part of myself. And I went out to Montana on a story after having lived in New York for a few years. And suddenly I could breathe again, and I recognized myself again. So I wouldn't say it was so much as an escape as a return to something I'd done before moving to the city.
So what is the rural cycle, do you think, in your head? What is that?
Well, it begins with day and night, it begins with being able to see the sun come up and things getting pretty dark once it goes down. And it also has an annual component. You're aware when things are being planted, when they're growing, and when they're being harvested. And then, the deep part of the cycle, which is midwinter, is one of, staying inside and trying to be cozy and warm and so on. And all the natural elements have a emphatic quality here that I don't think they do in an urban area. And you adjust your body and you adjust your lifestyle and your schedule accordingly. And pretty soon you're running with the big machine that God made.
Yeah. And do you, I know just before we started recording, you said that like me, you are an early riser. Are you an early sleeper too? Do you go to bed early like I do, about 8:30, which is embarrassing, but...
Well, it's impossible in the summer for me to go to bed too early. It stays light almost till 10 o'clock here. And,
wow.
But, I try. I probably stay up a little late for somebody who gets up as early as I do. Night times for reading. And it goes on depending on the book.
Yeah. You feel, it's sort of interesting. I'm feeling like you're a little bit of an anthropological prize for me today. I had a really, really bad day on a project yesterday where there was a kind of explosive event between people that I'm still kind of vibrating about. And I don't know really where it came from, except that it feels like a post-COVID craziness that has attacked us all in one form or another. But talking today was exactly the right therapy. And not that I'm going to burden you, but just to say that I feel when I speak to people like you who are in a rural life, who are understanding the way before, meaning to me, the way before digitization ruined everything. Mm-hmm. You give me hope for a renewal, right? I feel trapped in some ways here. Like it's unhealthy. Mm-hmm. And someone like you, you're smart, you're educated, you understand the value of that. And of course, with this new publication, which we're going to talk about in 1 second, mm-hmm. You represent a getting out of something and back into something that I think many of us are feeling very, very strongly about right now.
Yeah. Well, civilization, as I have come to understand it from my reading and studies, is periodically renewed by a back to basics movement. In even just superficial terms, you can look at the late 1950s and early 60s and the revival of folk music and and traditional music, the blues and so on. And I think that the time has definitely come to refresh ourselves with knowledge of the past and a reconnection to older things. I don't so much think of it as the past as the fundamental thing on which we stand. Sometimes you have to adjust your stance so that you are more solidly rooted. And I think the time for that has come, definitely.
Yes, I agree. Can I just ask you a question about Matt Taibbi, with whom you do a terrific podcast?
You sure can.
Thank you. He was one of the first guests on my show. God bless him. He's a sweetheart. But it was before everything kind of blew up. At that point, he was kind of struggling like, oh my God, where am I politically? What's happening to journalism? It's terrible. It's terrible. Right. And then, of course, now he's really hit because he's steadfast in his beliefs about things. But if you don't mind, I'm just wondering how he's doing. It feels like when I was watching him on the congressional hearings, I had a very mumsy response that he was being kind of unfairly picked on. I actually was a bit weepy watching him and Michael Schellenberger be treated so, so-called reporter, and are you making money and that garbage. How is he doing in being in the midst of this terrible, terrible storm right now?
I think Matt's doing amazingly well considering. He was picked on at that hearing. They tried to get him on his back foot almost instantly by questioning his credentials. His credentials, of course, couldn't be better. He's one of the greatest, most accomplished investigative journalists of our time.
Yeah.
But in front of that hearing, they treated him like a little boy. Now, Matt is, in some sense, boyish.
He is.
He has a perennial energy and zeal that comes from real idealism and a real belief that the kind of reporting he does can make things better, that once people know how things work, they can adjust them. So he's a very optimistic guy, just probably more than I, in fact.
Yeah.
He refuses to fall prey to total cynicism or any kind of paralysis. Right now he's down in New Orleans, attending a legal proceeding that has to do with the government's right or lack of rights to censor people through social media. And whenever that issue is at issue right now, he's there. He's found a new life, I think, since that Twitter files story in trying to awaken us to the fact that our media space, our communication space, is heavily, heavily controlled, and rather directly controlled, not in subtle ways, but down to the, most granular level where people at the top are seeing things they don't like said and issuing orders that they be silenced. And so, but I've done that podcast with Matt for about a year, and that preceded the Twitter files. And so I've been with him as he's kind of had his consciousness expanded, I guess would be the best word. And he I think feels it's quite unfair that he's lumped with all sorts of people who he's really not, just because he's standing up for civil liberties and for the integrity of the press and for the freedom of the people to openly express themselves. He's called all kinds of names now, and a Russian agent is the worst of them.
I know, it's just ridiculous.
And he continues to be offended by that, but I think less and less so. His skin has gotten a lot thicker.
Yeah. But you know what it was to you? I think you hit the nail on the head about him too, was just that he does, there is a boyishness about his countenance. And when they were picking on him, I could actually see across his face, like he looked deeply wounded but also baffled. Like, why are they saying these things to me? Of course I'm a journalist. It was quite moving to see, and a bit McCarthyistic, I think, in the way it played out. Maybe not.
Well, it really was. Matt's just a few years younger than me.
Yeah.
And for some reason, it may have to do with our contrasting temperaments. I think he's a slight bit more innocent about the absolute cynicism of the side that is pushing people down.
Yeah.
He continues. It's almost a superpower in a way. He continues to be upset by things that personally I've kind of resigned myself to. Matt, in order to do his reporting and in order to bring all this energy he has to bear on these problems, has to believe that it can make a difference. And there are days when I wake up and wonder. So it's a gift. It's a privilege to know someone like him.
Yeah.
Because whenever I get tired or whenever I feel a little fatalistic about things, I see the absolute, vivid, unstoppable, animated energy he brings to these subjects. He does not give up.
And for me, it's a bit old school because I was investigative journalist on a show like 60 Minutes up here in the 90s, and I had the same belief. And actually it was true. Like we got an innocent man out of jail on a murder charge who'd been locked. Like you could do those things in journalism then, right? Or you could bring down a pharmaceutical product based on good reporting, or you could whatever. And that stuff's just not happening anymore, which hurts, is painful. But the fact that Matt believes he can do it and is doing it, you're right. It is a lovely beacon, especially, and I want you to mention this too, if you don't mind. I was reading something you said about the digitization of journalism and how we should all fear that. And that has really, really been on my mind. Could you just talk about that for a minute?
Well, I don't know exactly what you're referring to, what statement or what essay. But
you were being interviewed by somebody, some really smart person. I didn't write down who it was. And you were talking about how reporters now don't go out. They don't go to a crime scene and talk to the cop on the corner and stand by the crime scene tape and learn about people. They're on their screens and they're viewing stories through screens. And so it seems that there's kind of a devolving in the art of practicing journalism because you're removing humanity in that sense, right? Like we have people called digital journalists. Like what are they reporting on actually? Like what are they doing? Right?
So I have been in this vocation, since the 1980s. And I've watched a steady diminution of our willingness or ability to be on the scene and to be surprised by what we find. When I worked for Time magazine, I went and I covered a forest fire. I went to the forest fire. They had people all over the country called stringers who lived in local places and would contribute local scenes to national stories and so on. Around the early 2000s, that started changing really strongly. It had to do with the lack of ad revenue as the internet took that money. And so fewer and fewer people were in place, fewer and fewer people traveled to their stories. And as that happened, you started to see a strange effect on the stories themselves. What was getting reported on was the reaction to things on social media and on the internet rather than the event itself. I started reading things about stories I happen to know something about locally that were reported only on social media and on the internet and got everything wrong. Besides not capturing the local flavor or the immediate flavor of the stories, they simply didn't know the facts. And there was no one to correct them because they were reporting off of Twitter or wherever. And so it's as though the world itself has been wrapped in this gauze of digital fog, and reporters don't even try to penetrate it anymore. They report on the reaction to the story rather than the story itself.
And I think, if I could just weigh in my own 2 cents, where I was a beat reporter back when that meant something. I was a police reporter. I had a little news cruiser with a police radio in it and stuff back when that happened, and municipal reporter, etc. And those beats and the way of practicing journalism in that sense, like in the olden days, was really propelled by human connection. What you were observing about the human beings, as opposed to just feeding information through some kind of a funnel into your story. And I told a story once about covering the locating of a body of a murdered little girl in Toronto down by the train tracks by River Street. And there was a big, mean old homicide detective named Inspector Crawford, who I'd always been afraid of. I showed up. I was in radio, so it was just me and my tape recorder. And he was lurking about. The body was over, far away with tape around it, etc. And I couldn't find Inspector Crawford, so I went, I think, into a building to have a smoke, and he was in there crying. It's this big, tough guy, this big galoot, as we would have called him. And it changed forever the way I viewed him, because we'd all thought he was a crank. And now we know, like, homicide detectives have really hard jobs.
Yeah.
And he'd just been over at that little girl's body, and he's thinking, how is he going to march over to tell the parents, right? So those things change you as a reporter and how you cover the world, don't they? And I don't think reporters today are doing that kind of meaningful, life-changing work, are they?
Well, let me give you a strange example, but a vivid example. At the 2016 Republican convention in Cleveland, I went for Harper's Magazine to report on Donald Trump's nomination, basically, but the whole convention. And I was with a national reporter a couple of days before he was to give his acceptance speech, and I said, what part of the convention hall are you going to be in? Maybe I can sit with you, or, we can talk as we watch the speech. And he said, well, I'm not going to be there. I'm going to be at one of the viewing centers. And I said, what do you mean? Well, his magazine and some other magazines had some off-site place where they would watch the thing on TV. So they were going to watch TV coverage of a story that they were supposed to cover themselves. And I thought, wow, they're not even going to the speeches. Now, this wasn't a question of lack of resources. They could easily walk over to the stadium itself, but they were choosing to sort of move back from the story, be among other reporters, and then watch the thing being reported rather than just watching it unfold raw. And that was a strange experience, but I've seen that over and over. As I say, it's a lot of reporters now are reporting on other reporting, and not doing their own. And that causes everybody to start to think and act and write the same way, because it becomes a social experience rather than a primary encounter with events.
And isn't the best journalism sometimes, especially the essay kind, finding a single human detail in a large event? In other words, if you couldn't keep me out of that convention hall that year, like I would have been absolutely determined to get in, whether I was invited or not, to watch what was happening. How are people reacting? What is Trump like in person? Is he really that tall? Does he huff and puff, or does he see me speaking out? I had like a million questions, right? So how could you not want to experience that and bring some of whatever was happening in that room and the detail of it to the people reading? I mean, that's really the apex of good essay writing and reporting, isn't it? Getting those details, right?
Well, I completely agree. And in this case, the result of me going to the stadium and a lot of other reporters sitting in these, pre-selected groups watching TV was that my impression of the speech was very different than theirs. I found the event much more powerful, mysterious, and likely to succeed, frankly, than those who were watching commentary on it and seeing it framed by the TV cameras. At that convention, over and over, I was confronted by the fact that I was seeing stuff that other people weren't, and they were catching vibes and reporting on sort of, miniature stories that they all agreed on and that they all thought were, important, but seemed trivial to me. The whole convention was dominated before Trump's speech by a controversy over whether Trump's wife's speech had been somehow cribbed from a speech that Michelle Obama had given years ago. Yeah. And they went back and forth on this as though it was the biggest thing that was happening. And it was a total tempest in a teapot that they had brewed up and were all competing to have opinions about.
He is a mystery, isn't he? I mean, I read a lot about Trump and study and follow him. I watch him on TV. I watch my interviews. I mean, he is maybe the biggest mystery in all ever of American political life. I mean, why does he keep going? What, why doesn't he just retire and golf? How can a guy who has such good ideas be such a chump about something? He's just a mystery to me. Have you got a bead on him? Have you figured him out?
Wow. No, I mean, I have my ideas. I have my theories. I've been covering Donald Trump in one way or another since the 1980s. I worked for a magazine in New York called Spy Magazine, which was actually edited by a Canadian fellow named Graydon Carter.
Yeah.
And our running joke in that magazine, which was kind of the magazine was kind of devoted to satirizing New York society particularly. And the running butt of all of our jokes was Donald Trump. And all the ways in which we made fun of him then are the ways that people still make fun of them. He's gauche. He's overblown. He's, cruel in some way.
Yeah.
He's crude. And so I've had Donald Trump in my sights for a long time. And as the years have gone by, I've gotten to know people who do know him pretty well. I don't. And my impression is that he is a pugnacious and extremely proud, egotistical man who will not be stopped. He loves a fight, and they've given him endless fights, and without them, I don't know what he'd do, but with them, he gets a kind of wind in his sails that never ends. And I think at this point, now that he has been president and that presidency is really his great accomplishment, he simply refuses to have it denigrated. And nothing's going to stop him. No number of legal challenges or
they're never ending.
Media hits are going to stop him. He's in for the long haul now. He probably could have retired earlier, but I don't think his psyche will let him.
And I suspect he will die maybe behind one of those lecterns giving one of his big, he just doesn't seem to be stopping. And it'll be so interesting to see how that plays out. I don't know what he represents to people in America. He does represent something important. And I even find myself, I was at the gym the other day talking to some of the young guys, mostly who worked there. And we were kind of joking that if we were American, we'd vote for Trump just because it would drive everybody crazy. And we wanted to see that. We wanted to see a kind of a blowing up of the narrative, in America right now. And but I know that he means more than that to people outside of the bi-coastal nightmare cities, right? And I don't take that lightly. I think that's important, and we need to remember that.
The United States has gone through a major social and economic transition, which has not been good for the vast majority of people. Let's put it that way. From free trade agreements to other mega events. The guy who lives in a smaller city or a smaller town, works in manufacturing or, traditional industry, has seen his prospects decline seriously. And Trump is really the only, I think, voice for those who have felt their futures were stolen from them. Mm-hmm. He's a good old Roman tribune of the people. Mm-hmm. And we have a kind of politics now which really ignores the experience of the middle class and certainly the lower middle class. The Democrat Party has changed from a party of the working person to a party of the educated professional.
Yeah.
And that's left a great opening for the likes of Donald Trump. So I sort of see him as a result of nature abhors a vacuum.
Yeah.
He's come into this world in which a lot of people feel silenced and ignored, and given them an avatar.
Yeah. So let's talk about your great new project. It's so good. It's like when you see something on Dragon's Den or whatever it's called down there, it has a different name down there, but where you pitch a product to 3 rich people and they invest in it, whatever it's called.
Right.
And you go, wow, I wish I'd thought of that. Sometimes there are some things that are just so perfect for the moment, right? That's the analogy I'm trying to make. And County Highway is exactly that. The name is perfect. The concept is perfect. I feel like I might have thought of it if somebody put me in a room and said, what do we really need right now? I feel like this is it. Not to oversell what you've done, but everything, the aesthetic, the type, the font, everything is great. And thank you for that. And where did you get the idea?
Well, I must share credit and maybe even give away the majority of credit to my partner, writer and editor named David Samuels. David, a few years ago, came up with the general concept. He said, I want to publish a magazine in the form of a 19th century newspaper. I want it to be available only physically, in an analog form, not on the internet. We're not going to give this away. You either buy the whole thing and read it, in your chair, story by story, or you don't get to read it at all. And he said, Walter, would you come in with me on this? And I immediately was attracted to the concept. I'm a big Mark Twain fan, and Twain got his start, as did many great American writers, in newspapers, writing local stuff, in his case, out in the Nevada mining camps. And so I saw how this could work. I saw its appeal. I agreed with David that sending off stories piece by piece to the internet wasn't working. People will read one thing and ignore the rest. And the beauty of a newspaper is that it's kind of a collage. If you turn the page and you open to one story, you see the others all around it, and you move sideways across the page after you've read, and you have to take it as a whole. And, you might ignore certain things, but you're aware of those headlines. And I thought this is a more holistic way to approach what's going on than people having an algorithm feed them what they are assessed to already be interested in. Because you can scan, because you can see so much at a glance, your mind is opened, and you're not just in this tunnel of your little interest for the moment or what has been sent to you. And I think that's a lot like how we go through the world in reality. You walk down the street, you see all kinds of people, but the internet and social media would have you focus on only the one person and only the one little spot in your vision, rather than the panorama. And we want to present a panorama.
And what sorts of stories are in the premiere edition? Give me a couple of headlines.
If I list them, they will almost seem random, which we consider a virtue. We have a story on the wheat harvest down in Oklahoma. Our big annual wheat harvest isn't going that well, and we wrote about that and one guy who's kind of figured out how to raise wheat in drought conditions and his heroic battle to do it that way and his successes. We've got a story on a historical story on one of America's greatest con men that, isn't up to the minute, but brings out a side of history that I think people don't know. We've got a story on the place called Joshua Tree, California, which is a was a hippie enclave outside of Los Angeles, where people listen to music and kind of relaxed and got away from the city, and which has now become a kind of monster of real estate development.
Oh, no.
Yeah. We've got a story on a weird museum here in Montana, which I wrote. There's a roadside museum called the Miracle of America Museum, in which one man, under instructions from God, and that's how he puts it, decided to collect everything he thought was important about America, from antique typewriters to Vietnam War era helicopters.
Wow.
And make a narrative of all this you might call junk, and run it as his own private Smithsonian. So I went up there and narrated my trip through the museum as though I were passing through 200 years of American history.
Nice. Nice.
We've got a story on a bobcat attack in Iowa.
Yeah. Animal attacks are good. Always good.
We've got a story about Austin, Texas, and a sort of urban legend there in which pet turtles for many years were flushed down the toilet or escaped into sewers and have now created a kind of micro population of turtles. It sounds like it's all pretty amusing and funny, but it's, though the tone may be light, you're going to meet, by way of these stories, all kinds of people.
Yes.
And hear all kinds of sub-stories that I think give you a pretty good idea of what's going on beyond the bright lights.
And what's interesting is, I want to say this just right, but you've given it this great name, County Highway. Love, love, love it. And it is a representation of the people who don't live in the coastal or other big cities, but it doesn't seem to me like you're fetishizing them either, right? It's not quaint in the sense of, I think it was used as something about Prairie Home Companion, which kind of like was a bit quaint, right? But this is, this actually, there is, I'm assuming, some reverence, but you also take very seriously that this is a real world of real people outside where people like you and I usually live, right?
Exactly. This is not a nostalgia trip.
Yes. Yeah.
Even though the newspaper may have a nostalgic appearance, we just think that's when newspapers looked best, and so we imitated that design. But no, we're not looking down on people, and we're not showing them as cute specimens of some world gone by. We're genuinely interested in what's happening now. And it's also not that we wouldn't cover what goes on in a place like New York or Los Angeles. It's just that we treat those places like they were just another American city, another American town. We wouldn't give them that center of the universe treatment that they're used to. Yeah. We're perfectly happy to have a story about Toledo, Ohio, and some small town in Nevada next to a story about something that happens in Los Angeles. But we're going to treat it as a whole, and we're not going to give this special privilege to metropolitan areas. Our joke motto is that we are America's only newspaper, and that's printed right on the front page. And what we mean by that is that we treat America as one big, small town.
Yeah.
And no parts of it are super special, and no parts of it are unworthy of coverage. We want to be even-handed, but we especially want to have an eye out for those things that aren't covered other places.
And would you just, for instance, I'm just putting my editorial hat on here, would you do, well, we even up here, we covered East Palestine just because it was such a perfect microcosm of people being screwed over by BlackRock or whoever actually owns Norfolk Southern. But,
right.
But would you, in that case, that was covered a bit, and more so because it could be kind of weaponized politically against Pete Buttigieg, which is probably a pretty good idea, but and other things. But would you go there and maybe stay there? Would you say because that's out of the more kind of Masters of the Universe towns that you would have maybe made East Palestine an ongoing event for you over a year? Would you look at something like that? Or is that event so big that you're not looking for those things? You want to find things people actually aren't talking about? Because I think you would have covered East Palestine differently, is what I'm saying, right? So small town America covered differently, even if it's a big story, is what I'm saying.
Yes. Oh, no, we're not averse to covering big stories. Just because parts of the paper might be what other people would call quirky doesn't mean we are averse to stories that are at the center of the national conversation or where real life and death events take place. So yes, we would cover that. Unfortunately, the way things are going right now, there are going to be other East Palestines, and
No kidding.
that industrial accident, that railroad, crash that happened there, and the subsequent toxic release is probably not the last of such events. And when the next one happens, we'll be there.
Yeah. It's important, I think, because the other thing you guys can do, if I may, is you cannot move on. Like, we have these big moments and everybody covers it and then no one talks about it again, like, ever. Right. So, right. Sometimes the best journalism is where you just stick with something and keep unfolding it, because people.
Right. And if we miss the beginning, so many journalists these days think if they missed the big event, the spectacular part of the story, they should ignore the rest of it. And we should probably go to East Palestine now.
Yes.
And cover the fallout, as it were, or just every attempt to maybe get back to normal, or maybe do another story about the place which has a sidelight coming from this primary story. You know what I mean?
I do.
Because I'm sure its effects have been manifold and rippled out in all kinds of ways, and individuals' stories intersect with that big one. And, I think that, like I said, we don't want to avoid big stories, but the way we cover them might end up being a little differently. We're not trying to compete with the wire services. We might take a very specific angle on the thing. Talk about one farmer who's maybe lost a crop because of chemical poisoning, or something like that, and try to human scale the story.
It's kind of like what you're describing as the New Yorker, in a sense, as I remember it, but written about the heartland specifically, in a way. Because I remember New Yorker at its heyday. I had a stack of them by my bathtub. And the best stories they did were where they would find a story that we all were talking about. And they'd find a way in that was so interesting and so human that you were hooked from the first sentence.
Oh, I completely agree. And we're actually very conscious of this comparison. I grew up in Minnesota in a house, one of whose bathrooms was wallpapered in New Yorker covered. The idea of the New Yorker was to treat New York City as a small town. Goings on about town was is the opening feature there, in which various little stories are combined into a tapestry. The problem was that the New Yorker it became a national magazine, and it always was to some extent, but it treated the rest of the country with a certain condescension, I have to say. Eventually it got into that rut, and it was aware of its New York centricness. Obviously, they had a famous cartoon, the New Yorker map of the world, and you saw the skyline of Manhattan standing tall in the foreground, and then you saw this sort of flat nothingness stretching out to the west. And County Highway's idea is to turn that map inside out or backwards and stand in the middle and look at the edges as though they're not quite as important as they might believe they are.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's impossible not to have been raised on the great journalism that places like the New Yorker ran, and not want to take the best from it. And as you say, one of the things they really did well was find very up close and sort of angular views of bigger stories.
Yeah. I remember Janet Malcolm's piece, The Journalist and the Murderer. Do you remember that story about?
Oh, I sure do. It's my wife's a journalist, and she writes for the New Yorker.
Okay.
And it's one of her favorite books.
Yeah.
And
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I worked on that. What's his name? Jeffrey MacDonald. And
Yes.
I read the book by the guy who, I forget who the writer was, but it was a huge seller.
Joe McGinnis.
Joe McGinnis, thank you. And then I read that, and she had the great line in it. And your wife will probably love this line too, where she said that the best investigative journalists have a bit of the confidence man to them, because we have to convince people to do stuff, right? You can't
Right.
get the story if you're not luring a source into talking to you. And of course, the premise of the article was that Joe McGinnis had lured Dr. MacDonald in under false pretenses. But what a great, that was the New Yorker at its heyday, if you ask me.
The line was something like, "Journalists are always selling someone out," and
yes.
It was quite damning. And
yeah.
one of the, it's funny. There are certain things that in my career as a magazine writer always made me uncomfortable, and one of them was when I was sent by my editors to basically make fun or criticize someone. To write a big profile of someone, but I knew back at the magazine they didn't like that person, or they wanted a specific conclusion, and I would go out and I would feel like a phony, like a spy, or some kind, like you say, some kind of con man, as I won the person's trust, and then I sort of picked out from my interactions with them the least flattering bits and pieces. I never was to my own credit, I was never able to do that well. I usually failed in those profiles. The weird thing about me as a journalist was I ended up seeing the point of view of almost everyone I was sent to cover.
I think that's charming. But no, it's true. Like I kind of made my career doing what we now call accountability interviews of the Mike Wallace style. Mike Wallace was a religion in my house on Sunday night.
Right.
My dad would say, "Be quiet, Mike's coming on," and we'd watch him eviscerate people. Yeah. And so it was the same feeling. Like I'd go in to some poor schmo who'd agreed to be interviewed by us, and we decided he'd done very bad things.
Right.
And I'd go in with a sheaf of documents and sit there like a bit of a dumb blonde. And then, midway through it would start happening, like the cross-examination with we have a document here that says that do you recall this? And then and I always felt kind of bad about it at the end of the day. It was sort of an interesting way to make a living for a while. I don't think that's fair now. We used to do jump interviews too, where I kind of with a crew find somebody on the street and say, "Have you got a comment?" I don't think that's probably fair, because everybody looks guilty, don't they, when a camera's rolling?
True, but on the other hand, there are a lot of people who deserve to have their feet held to the fire these days who aren't getting that treatment. I mean, if Mike Wallace were alive today, I'd like to think that there are a lot of characters in public life who he'd be giving a pretty damn hard time to, and they're getting a pass right now.
Oh, I love that you just said that, because that is exactly how I feel. Like Albert Bourla, for one, and why aren't people scrumming Biden in a meaningful way about the devil? Like, what? Like, they know they can get away with everything because no one's doing that anymore. I'm so glad you said that, Walter.
Well, I mean, let's just be straight about things. Albert Bourla's company, Pfizer, and the companies like his keep TV advertising and alive. I mean, you're not gonna break for a Pfizer ad and then come back to a tough interview with Albert Bourla. It's not gonna happen.
No. Well, it's interesting because the jumping interviews did happen at the WEF. I think it was last year. And some of these little citizen journalist people and a company called Rebel News here, which is pretty conservative, a bit more probably than I am in my heart of hearts, but they do some interesting stuff with young people. And the young people were fearless. They did a jump interview of Albert Bourla and I was cheering. I was like, yay, get him. Because he was really pissed off that he was so like Fauci, right? He was so unused to being questioned in an aggressive way that it became this wonderful little piece of theater that revealed very much about how those guys live,
Well, there are financial reasons why the big shots don't get roasted anymore. And like I said, one of them is because at least in the pharmaceutical industry, they own vast portfolios of ads and so on. But I also think that journalists themselves have become a little less willing to sacrifice popularity to the story. Maybe it's just not worth it to them to take all the blowback. The narratives are set from on high, and if you go against them, you really pay a price. And I always knew that when I was working for Time, for example. It was in the back of my head what the magazine thought of various issues. And if I was to contest that, my piece wouldn't be published, and I might find my career foreshortened.
Yeah.
It wasn't that bad, though. Now I think it's really bad.
Really bad.
I mean, it's not like anybody's being threatened, but social media allows everybody to take the temperature constantly of what is likely to happen if they say X or do Y. And the minute they sense they're at variance with the powers that be, they back off.
But I think that's true, but I also think it's a kind of a cultural siloing that people, not in every place, but in most journalistic orgs, at least up here, they're like-minded. They are, to use a phrase, woke. They do believe they learn it in J school. It's a noble thing for them to bring to their reporting. And so that, I think that's very much part of it too. Those people are different than me. They see the world differently. They have no problem understanding that they're making a big moral judgment, and therefore the stories are going to be seen through their framework, even though it might be wrong, or the danger in that. So I think that's part of it too, that they're just different than you and I are, actually, Walter, in that way.
Yeah, and there's a lot of social sorting that's gone on. The old city paper reporter had to meet people of all kinds. Okay, They had to meet the cop, the victim, the lawyer, the bartender, the witnesses, the people on the street, the government officials, all together, and they saw a lot of points of view at once. Now journalism has gotten to be a kind of very professional, somewhat insulated endeavor. And because you can do so much reporting electronically, you just don't have to get to know all these people. And so you can fall back into your tribe. You can fall back into your little insulated in-group very easily. And when you're told constantly that you're on the right side of everything, and that there is a right side to everything, then it gets pretty easy, I think, to succumb to inside opinion over the surprising variations of real life.
Yeah, narrative stitching. I don't want to run out of time, but I do want to ask you this for my listeners who I know will love this question of you. Because you kind of, like an anthropologist on Mars, like you've kind of done something that many of us want to be doing. And I guess I'd like you to describe for us and remind us of the beauty of living not in these places, like how not necessarily rural life, but small towns too. Yeah. What that brings to us as human bipeds, even like what we're missing now. And I ask you that for this reason, Walter. A lot of people are very crushed by COVIDian life. We lost our humanity. We lost our ability to socialize. We're suspicious of each other. We don't trust our institutions. So that's a stress and a strain. And our nervous systems are dialed up to 11, like Spinal Tap, right? We're all in fight or flight. And some of us are saying, wow, Montana sounds good. Or, some other smallish town sounds good. Mm-hmm. So tell us about what those places and that kind of thinking can do for us, I guess, from a renewal perspective, if we want to hit a reset.
Yeah. When I go out the door in Livingston, Montana, population 7,000, I am not in control of who stops and speaks to me, who I cross paths with. I'm going to meet all kinds of people with all kinds of different opinions. But we're going to have to get along. I can't edit any of them out because I may have to rely on them. My car might break down and they come along to help fix it. I might get stuck in some other way and need their help. I'm going to go into a store and see them at the checkout counter and so on. So in these small places, you have to constantly remind yourself of the humanity of everybody around you and find a place to meet psychologically, emotionally, outside of your views or your political opinions. And so that, I think, keeps alive a just general sense of empathy and openness toward life and events. You can't hole up. You can't hide out. If you make an enemy, you're going to meet them the next day. These arguments that you have on social media where you're never going to see the person again, or you can just block them and make them disappear from your universe, are artificial because they have no real consequences.
So true.
In a small town, that you have consequences for every interaction. And you also learn the stories of people so that maybe they ticked you off, or they said something weird, or they think differently than you in a way that you find even upsetting. But you also know who their kids are, and you know that they've got a sick parent at home, and you can see deeper into their stories. And when we encounter each other as stories rather than just little bits of flashing opinion, we have a lot more depth to our relationships. And I think it's depth that we're all looking for right now. We cross paths on the internet with more people than you used to meet in 2 weeks, but it's such a superficial, quick, and consequence-free encounter that it's more disorienting than anything else. And we can use it to make our own narratives seem stronger. But in a small town, or a smaller city or a neighborhood, you have a feeling that you're encountering a person in the round, and you know something of their challenges, you know something of their background, something of their history. Maybe you know that they have a terrible, ogre-like father who has, kind of made them a grumpy person, and so you can excuse them. Yeah. But whatever, we have to know more about each other and have, I think, fewer encounters of a higher quality if we're going to cooperate politically and socially and so on.
And what you're describing really is the opposite to, and maybe the antidote to, how we lived during COVID and lockdowns, and even the work from home phenomena, which I think is one of the most dangerous things ever to happen to us, because you don't have those encounters at the coffee machine. Like, I just had this big fight. It was actually at someone's house, but the tension had been building because we're working together and not in the same building even, right? So you don't have a chance to say, well, did you see the latest, Succession last night? Holy smokes. What's Logan Roy doing now? And then all of the stuff you were mad about, right? It's gone because you're relating as a human being. And so work from home is wrecking that. And what you're describing is kind of the opposite of work from home, that you're forced to have encounters with people, in part because you rely on each other too, don't you?
Well, so if I walk down to the post office 2.5 blocks from me right now, and a UFO appears on the horizon,
Yes.
there's a bunch of people who will stop on the street and look up and see it together. But if they're all working from home and they'll go, wow, that's the weirdest thing. And they'll compare notes, and ever after they'll meet up and say, remember when we saw that flying saucer?
Yeah.
But if everybody's working from home, all they saw were, little film clips of this. They didn't have a common experience. It didn't bond them at all. And they may on their home computer see it, and then they see opinions about what it is and different edited versions of it, and there's likely to be divided on their opinion of what happened as brought together. So just being physically together in places that allow for that and encountering life is a thing that knits society. But everyone having this tiny little peephole with all kinds of filters on it and all kinds of voices telling them what it means that even big events divide because they're received separately and in a very slanted way.
Would you think about doing any Canadian stories in your paper?
We should talk about it.
Yeah.
We're in the midst of a launch. We've been around for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And we publish only at this point 6 times a year. And that seems very infrequently for a newspaper. But let me tell you, if you sit down with the thing, it will take you a week to read.
Yay!
There are so many words, so many stories.
Yeah.
And some of the older folks tell me they're printed in too small print. But that's why they give you those glasses. That's why they sell those magnifying glasses at the drugstore.
Yeah.
But I think that, going forward, this is going to maybe become a more frequent paper. And the reaction has been incredible. We've gotten as many subscriptions in 3 weeks as we expected to get in 3 years. And
wow.
That's no lie.
Well, people are yearning for it. I'm about, when we're finished here, to sign up and get it myself. And I'm really looking forward to the experience, because it doesn't just call you to read, but it calls you to read in a certain way. And whether you actually meant to do this or not, the fact that it looks like an old-timey broadsheet, it might affect people in a more calming way. Like I hate reading off screens. I drive my husband crazy because I print everything off I'm going to read. If it's a long article and I'm going...
My wife does the exact same thing, Trish.
Yeah.
It drives me crazy. She comes down to my office because she's run out of all the paper and toner in her printer.
Yes, exactly the same. Drives him crazy. We go through reams and reams of it, and it's expensive, right? Especially the toner is expensive. Yeah. So that's a different experience. I can't read off a screen, and I'm just wondering if your beautiful little paper or big paper will maybe on some subconscious level make people kind of sit a while, like really understand that you're not going to see, this is a 3-second read at the top or a 3-minute read, right? When you do that, I wonder.
I think some people turn from the front page to the jump, and they suddenly discover that the 1-column story they're reading on the front page is a 4-column story on the inside. And they go, I better get in a rocking chair if I'm going to finish this. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. The style of the paper is kind of a hypnotic prompt, asking you to slow down and stay still.
Oh, God bless you. Well, I'm going to maybe purchase some and put them for sale in a loved one's store or something like that, so Canadians know that it's, because look, we all read the Financial Times, and that's all about the UK anyway. So why can't we up here read a wonderful American paper with great writing and quasi literature, literary reporting in it? Why wouldn't we do that? So, but
When we write about the Great Plains wheat harvest, we're just writing about the southern part of it. It goes right up, right up through the border.
Yeah.
You know?
But sometimes just reading those things is nurturing. Everything doesn't have to be immediately local either to affect, the way we view the world. So I just say congratulations a million times. I'm your perfect fan because I was an old-timey journalist before computers and internet existed, believe it or not. Yes, I am that old. And I resisted an email, and I don't think the world is a better place. I'm not a Luddite, but I don't think the world is a better place. And I think we are, in a sense, kind of reaping what we sow by embracing new technology without a single question about what it's going to do to our lives. I hate that. And yeah.
We don't eat that way. We don't eat everything that's put in front of us. Nope. At some point, we've got to stop and say, can we just step back and only eat the stuff that's good for us?
Yeah.
And I think it's time to take that step back.
Yeah, I'm with you. Anyway, thanks so much for doing it. I couldn't be more grateful, and you're so much fun to talk to. Thank you.
Trish, thank you. Bye.
Bye. So that was Walter Kern talking about this wonderful new little newspaper called County Highway. And you can order it online. They'll send it to you in the mail in a little wrapper. And then you can hold it like it's precious cargo and unfold it on a park bench or in your backyard or at your kitchen table and have a bit of a read of a well-written newspaper being produced by smart and decent and thoughtful people. How fun! I can hardly wait. I just want to read something that he said about how we cover news now. I think he's brilliant on that. And I could have talked to him about it for 5 hours because we're so like-minded and kind of nostalgic for how it used to be. He says, let's take the problem of where COVID came from. The very latest, as we speak now in June of 2023, is that COVID leaked from a lab in China. I don't think anybody doubts that now. It's pretty strongly suggested that it came from a lab in China that was doing terrible research and that the virus itself is some kind of engineered entity. Go back 3 months. This was still being debated, and people who were fundamentalists on the lab leak were still 3 months ago, certainly 6 months ago, thought to be somehow unkosher, perhaps xenophobic, and maybe Trump-adjacent radicals. That's so absolutely true. But if we go back all the way to the beginnings of COVID, it was almost the first common sense assumption. Each slice of this narrative is only credible if you forget the one before. Wait for a second. I'm being told that the much vaunted American intelligence community has now officially determined the same thing that got me kicked off social media 8 months ago for agreeing with. I mean, right? So this is the other problem, is the way we're consuming media. They, especially with propaganda, the Wuhan lab leak story is being handed as a perfect propaganda enterprise to sow. Clearly it's true, and they're trying to sow as much confusion as they possibly can, like they did around the Hunter Biden laptop story, right? I want you to listen to this next little bit of interview. It's me and Salome Siboney, who is a visual artist and writer. She's a young woman, a wonderfully critically thinking young person. I admire that very, very much. We had a great, great time, and I was thrilled to give her some airtime on the show. She's going to be a premium for us next week. It will drop in the premium section of Substack. So if you're a premium member, which means that you've bought a subscription, you'll get to hear the interview in full. So please do have a listen to this, and then I'll be back to say goodbye. Hi, Salome. How are you?
I'm very good. Very excited to be here with you.
Well, thank you. Me too. I think I'm going to treat you a little bit like I'm an anthropologist on Mars, because you're quite young, or at least you look quite young, and yet you have what is, at least in my purview, in my way of thinking, a really sophisticated worldview. And sadly, that is more rare in younger people today than I'd hoped. You guys are supposed to be the ones who are like, yeah, screw the man, and we hate corporate America, blah blah blah. But it sort of feels like something else is maybe happening in your demographic. So let me ask you first, do you feel that some of the views that you kind of espouse and cherish set you now against or in conflict with other people your age? Is it harder for you to move around in circles? Because what you say and write about feels kind of radical to me in the very best way, of course.
Thank you. I agree. It's radical in the best way. That's how I like to think of what I do with my work, is to push back on a lot of these restrictive and regressive cultural changes that we're seeing. And yeah, by the nature of pushing back on dominant changes in culture, it does absolutely put me in a position of tension, antagonism. It's often very solitary. I have definitely felt for a long time that I am kind of a black sheep amongst my peers. When I was younger, that feeling was very uncomfortable. And so it led me to kind of accept the views that were dominant amongst my peers, which are a lot of the kind of leftist, some call them quote unquote woke, every day a new ideology that we have to espouse, whether it's, ever complicated pronouns, or the idea that speech is harm, or the idea that we have no way to tell the difference between a man and a woman. Whatever it is, all of these things were percolating in our culture when I was younger. I would say in my around 18, 19, 20, 21. And that was before it broke out onto the mainstream. And so at that time, there was still this growing pressure to hold the quote unquote right ideas, because unlike in generations of the past where, yeah, we've always applied morality to the ideas that people hold as a way to try to, judge people based on their ideas. If you are a conservative, you must be like this, and maybe that's bad. If you are a progressive, you must be like this, and maybe that's good. But now it's almost become all encompassing that you are your political views. And if you don't have the quote unquote right political views, you are bad. And as a younger person, that was a really difficult dynamic to navigate, because I was still figuring myself out. I was still figuring out my identity and what I wanted to do in the world. And suddenly I had to navigate this intense pressure to perform the right ideas, to be a good person, or else I was one of those terrible conservatives that hate people and is racist and bigoted and is ruining the world. Little did I know that there's a lot more complexity there. And one of the things that most ruins the world is when people are unable to freely express themselves and ask questions, which is what I've learned to do now. And yeah, it definitely puts me at odds with the dominant culture of my peers. I often find that I hesitate still to truly express myself when I'm in a group of new people, because I expect that they're going to view my ideas as contentious.
Amen, sister, to everything you just said. That was Salome Siboney, and you can hear her on my Substack next week in the premium section. She's terrific, and I admire her. I want to close with a letter I got from a listener. The people write the most miraculous things, and I'm always so very moved by them. Dear Trish, I hope this email isn't too late in response to last week's podcast with Jeffrey Tucker. I've been thinking on it more than I expected. There was a point he made about listening to a bird singing outside when he was in a funk and thinking how nice it would be to be a bird. I had that exact same thought a week before. So I brooded and then wondered why I was brooding. Curse of the critical mind, they say. I agree with that. Then I realized something. All of the compliant, good, responsible people, the ones who did the right thing, the selfless thing, all the people are like the two singing birds, unburdened by the data, the real science, or the truth. They are blissfully unaware and happier for it. Why look back now? The emergency's over. And we, the awakened ones, are sad, desperate, and tired of trying to help them see. When does the stress go? How does it manifest? Despite living healthfully, exercising, not smoking or drinking, one of the kindest people I have ever known died quite unexpectedly last month. She was full of cancer and didn't know it. She was a true freedom fighter. We met as dissidents and rallied together. Wow. The last message I got from her bluntly stated that all this trauma is too much and we have to get it out of our systems. She reluctantly spent her last week in the hospital before she passed. We're going to hear more of these stories too, I'm convinced of it. There is something extra heavy about this burden. At times it feels like I have peered behind the curtain, but no one else will believe me. So I stop sharing. Now that it's all over and the good ones can pat themselves on the back, the rest of us will continue to simmer. Some days are worse than others. New data, new court cases, new proof, and new hope that sizzles and splutters away. The subject can't come up anymore despite the mounting evidence. I get the pitiful smirks and head shaking, poor soul hanging on to conspiracies. Or is it anger? Everyone wants to just live and not talk about viruses, politics, wars, climate, etc. I get it, but I can't unlearn what I've learned. About a year ago, I politely shared some data with a family member. Her response was, "What am I supposed to do with this information? I'd rather not know." The same person had told me some months prior that if I didn't comply, I did not deserve a hospital bed for any reason. I shared the information in hopes that she would adjust her opinion, see the error of her ways, and maybe apologize. More fool me. Your podcasts have been a refuge of sanity. Thank you. I'm sorry for this lengthy email, but I felt compelled. The birds are singing outside. All the best. Wow. So there's a lot of people who feel that way out there. I know it. And I feel that way a little bit myself today. As I said, I've had a really crappy week, a shitty week. And I rarely swear on this show, but it was. But look, we've got County Highway now to look forward to 6 times a year. And I mean that. I'm not being glib. It's going to be wonderful. And maybe we can get them to sell in the UK to our listeners there, and in Canada to our listeners here, and maybe Australia and New Zealand too. They can do like a globalist edition. Just kidding. But it would be nice. Anyway, I'd love some small town America and heartland thinking delivered to my postbox, as they say. So do stay critical, and I'll see you.
I've been selling my soul, working all day, overtime hours for bullshit pay, so I can sit out here and waste my life away, drag back home and drown my troubles away. It's a damn shame what the world's gotten to for people like me, people like you. Wish I could just wake up and it not be true, but it is. Oh, it is living in the new world with an whole soul. These rich men north of Richmond, Lord knows they all just wanna have total control. Wanna know what you think, wanna know what you do, and they don't think you know, but I know that you do, 'cause your dollar ain't shit, and it's taxed to no end, 'cause the rich men, know the rich men. I wish politicians would look out for minors, and not just minors on an island somewhere. Lord, we got folks in the street, ain't got nothing to eat, and the obese milking welfare. Well, God, if you're 5'3" and you're 300 pounds, taxes ought not to pay for your bags of fudge rounds. Young men are putting themselves 6 feet in the ground, 'cause all this damn country does is keep on kicking them down. Lord, it's a damn shame what the world's gotten to for people like me, people like you. Wish I could just wake up and it not be true, but it is. Oh, it is living in the new world with an whole soul. These rich men north of Richmond, Lord knows they all just want to have total control. Want to know what you think, want to know what you do, and they don't think you know, but I know that you do, 'cause your dollar ain't shit, and it's taxed to no end, 'cause the rich men, north of Richmond. I've been selling my soul, working all day, overtime hours for bullshit pay.